It started with a simple leak. Nothing extraordinary for a building as old as Rosie's Diner, a fixture in Chicago's Logan Square neighborhood since 1962. The small puddle spreading across the checkered floor near the counter was the first sign of trouble, but certainly not the last. Megan Turner had inherited the diner from her grandmother 3 years ago. At 35, she'd left her corporate job to preserve the family business, despite knowing little about running a restaurant. What she did know was that water damage could destroy everything her grandmother had built. "I've got a guy who can look at it tomorrow," said Hector, the short-order cook who'd worked at Rosie's for nearly 2 decades. His dark eyes followed the trail of water that seemed to be coming from behind the counter. "We can't wait until tomorrow," Megan replied, running her fingers through her auburn hair. "It's getting worse by the hour." The basement of Rosie's had always made Megan uneasy. The narrow wooden staircase creaked with each step as she and Hector descended with flashlights in hand. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something older and more pungent. "There," Hector pointed to a corner where the concrete floor met the ancient brick wall. Water seeped through a crack, forming a growing pool. "That's not good. The main water line runs under there." Megan sighed, already calculating the cost. "I'll call someone tonight." The plumber, Ed Winters, arrived early the next morning before the diner opened. A heavy-set man in his 50s, with calloused hands and 30 years of experience, he inspected the basement with practiced eyes. "You've got a problem with the main line, all right," Ed confirmed, "but there's something else." He ran his hand along the brick wall. "This wall shouldn't be here. According to the city plans, your basement extends another 15 feet. "What?" Megan frowned. "That can't be right. This has always been the back wall." Ed shrugged. "Plans don't lie. Sometimes old buildings have sections that get sealed off. Happens more than you'd think in Chicago." "So what does that mean for the leak?" "Means I need to break through this wall to access the line. Might take a couple days. I'll need to bring my apprentice Jake to help." As Ed outlined his plan, Megan felt a strange sense of dread. The basement had always felt wrong to her, and now they were planning to break through walls that had stood for decades. But what choice did she have? "Fine," she said finally. "When can you start?" First thing tomorrow," Ed replied, his flashlight beam revealing ancient water stains on the ceiling. "Better close the diner for a few days. This could get messy." That night, after the last customer had left, and the grill had cooled, Megan returned to the basement alone. She told herself she was just checking the leak, but something else had drawn her down there. The wall that Ed said shouldn't exist seemed to call to her. She placed her palm against the cold bricks, feeling the dampness and something else, a subtle vibration, almost like a pulse. Megan quickly withdrew her hand, telling herself it was just her imagination or maybe water pressure in the pipes. As she turned to leave, her flashlight caught something in the corner of the room, a small object half buried in the dirt floor. Kneeling down, she carefully brushed away decades of dust to reveal a tarnished silver locket. It seemed impossibly old, its surface etched with intricate patterns she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Without thinking, Megan slipped the locket into her pocket. Only later would she understand that this simple act had set in motion events that could never be undone. Ed and his apprentice Jake arrived at 7 a.m. sharp the next morning, carrying heavy tool bags and an air of professional confidence. Jake was in his mid-20s, with tattoo sleeves visible beneath his rolled-up flannel shirt and an easy smile that contrasted with Ed's gruff demeanor. "Should take us about a day to break through and assess the damage," Ed explained, as they set up work lights in the basement. "Then maybe another day for the actual repair, depending on what we find." Megan nodded, trying to ignore the locket that now felt heavy in her pocket. She hadn't told anyone about finding it and wasn't sure why. "I'll be upstairs doing inventory. Just shout if you need anything." The sound of hammering and drilling filled the diner as the morning progressed. Occasionally, Megan would pause in her work, listening to the muffled conversation between Ed and Jake, punctuated by the crack of breaking masonry. Around noon, she brought them sandwiches and coffee. As she descended the stairs, she noticed the air had changed. It was colder, with an unfamiliar metallic scent that reminded her of pennies left in the rain. "How's it going?" she asked, setting down the food on a wooden crate. Ed wiped dust from his forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Making progress. You were right to call us. This wall shouldn't be here. The brickwork is different from the rest of the foundation, probably added sometime in the 1940s. Jake was examining the section they'd already broken through, shining his flashlight into the darkness beyond. "There's definitely a space back here," he confirmed, "and pipes running through it, old cast iron stuff. Any idea why someone would wall off part of the basement?" Megan asked, the locket suddenly feeling heavier in her pocket. Ed shrugged. "Could be anything. Buildings this old, they've got history. Maybe they had structural issues. Maybe they were hiding something." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "My money's on prohibition. Secret storage space for bootleg liquor." Megan nodded, though something told her the truth was darker than hidden whiskey barrels. After lunch, the work continued. By mid-afternoon, Ed and Jake had created an opening large enough to crawl through. Megan had tried to focus on her inventory, but eventually gave up and joined them in the basement. "Well, look at that," Ed said, shining his flashlight through the opening. "Seems like there's a whole room back there." The beam cut through decades of dust, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond: concrete flooring, water-stained walls, and what appeared to be old furniture covered in yellowed sheets. "I'm going in," Jake announced, already positioning himself at the opening. "Careful," Ed warned. "Floor might not be stable." Jake nodded and crawled through the hole, coughing as his movements disturbed years of settled dust. Megan and Ed watched as his flashlight beam danced across the hidden room. "There's all kinds of stuff back here," Jake's voice came through, slightly muffled. "Looks like someone was living down here at some point. There's an old bed frame, some chairs, a desk." Suddenly, Jake's light caught something that made him go silent. "Jake?" Ed called. "What is it?" When Jake spoke again, his voice had changed. "You should see this. Both of you." Ed went through next, grunting with the effort, while Megan hesitated at the opening. The locket in her pocket seemed to grow colder, almost burning against her skin through the fabric. Taking a deep breath, she crawled through the hole in the wall. As she stood up in the hidden room, dust particles dancing in the beams of their flashlights, she saw what had silenced Jake. On the far wall, barely visible beneath years of grime, someone had painted hundreds of symbols, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. And at the center of the wall, a phrase written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood: "They are beneath us all." No one spoke for several long moments. The only sound was their breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Finally, Ed broke the silence. "Probably just some nutjob squatter," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This building's been around since the Great Depression, bound to have attracted all types." Jake moved closer to the wall, studying the symbols. "I don't think these are random," he said quietly. "They look like some kind of language." Megan felt the locket burning against her thigh. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around it. The metal was ice-cold, despite having been in her pocket all day. "We should focus on the pipes," she said, trying to sound practical. "That's what we're here for, right?" Ed nodded gratefully, clearly relieved to return to familiar territory. "The main line should be running under this section. We'll need to break up some of this concrete to access it." They spent the next hour trying to ignore the writing on the wall as Ed and Jake assessed the plumbing situation. Megan made excuses to return upstairs several times, but found herself drawn back to the hidden room each time. During one of her trips upstairs, she finally examined the locket more closely, under good light. The tarnished silver was engraved with the same symbols she'd seen on the wall. With trembling fingers, she tried to open it, but the mechanism seemed fused shut. When she returned to the basement, Ed and Jake had marked an area of concrete for removal. "We'll need to use the jackhammer," Ed explained. "The break is definitely under here somewhere." Jake was unusually quiet, still casting glances at the wall of symbols. As they prepared the equipment, he approached Megan. "I took some pictures of those markings," he admitted in a low voice. "I've got a friend who studies ancient languages at the university. Thought maybe he could tell us what they mean." "You think they're that old?" Megan asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her pocket. Jake shrugged. "I don't know. They don't look like any graffiti I've ever seen." The jackhammer roared to life, drowning out further conversation. Ed worked methodically, breaking through the decades-old concrete. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, and dust filled the air, forcing them to wear masks. After 20 minutes, Ed shut off the machine. "I think we've hit something," he said, kneeling to examine the hole they'd created. Jake shined his flashlight into the opening. "That's not a pipe," he said slowly. Megan moved closer, peering over their shoulders. The jackhammer had broken through to another space beneath the concrete floor, a narrow gap that shouldn't have existed. Ed widened the hole with a sledgehammer, revealing what looked like a small tunnel extending into darkness. The air that wafted up from the opening was stale and carried that same metallic scent Megan had noticed earlier, only stronger now. "This doesn't make any sense," Ed muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "There shouldn't be anything under this floor except soil and foundation." Jake lay flat on his stomach, directing his flashlight into the hole. "It looks man-made, like somebody dug this out by hand." He looked up at Ed. "You think it could be connected to the old Prohibition tunnels? I've heard Chicago's full of them." Ed frowned. "Maybe, but those were mostly downtown, near the river, not out here in Logan Square." Megan felt lightheaded as she stared into the darkness below. The locket in her pocket seemed to pulse with cold energy. "I'm going to take a closer look," Jake announced suddenly, already lowering himself into the opening. "Jake, wait," Ed began. But his apprentice had already disappeared into the hole, leaving only his legs visible. "There's definitely a tunnel down here," Jake's voice echoed strangely. "It's about 4 feet high, heads east toward Milwaukee Avenue." There was a pause. "There's something else down here too." "What is it?" Megan called, fighting back a surge of inexplicable terror. Jake's answer came back distorted, as if he were suddenly much farther away than he should have been. "Looks like tools. Old ones and some bones. Maybe animal bones?" Ed grabbed Jake's legs. "That's enough exploring for today. Come on back up." As Jake emerged from the hole, his face was pale beneath the layer of dust, his eyes wide. In his hand, he held something. A rusted metal object that Megan recognized immediately as a plumber's wrench, ancient and corroded, but unmistakable. "Found this down there," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly, "along with a whole set of tools. Looks like somebody was working down there and just left everything behind." Ed took the wrench, examining it with professional interest. "This is old, really old, probably from the 30s or 40s. Why would someone leave their tools?" Megan asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Jake and Ed exchanged a look but said nothing. The unspoken question hung in the air. What had happened to the last person who tried to fix the plumbing at Rosie's diner? Night had fallen by the time they decided to stop work for the day. Ed and Jake packed up their equipment, careful to avoid the hole they'd created in the floor. "We'll come back tomorrow with better equipment," Ed said, sounding more like he was trying to convince himself than Megan. "Maybe call in a structural engineer first, just to be safe." Megan nodded, watching as Jake placed the rusted wrench with their other tools. "What about—" She gestured toward the hole. "I'll cover it with plywood for now," Ed assured her. "Best not to leave it open." After they left, Megan locked up the diner and retreated to the small apartment above the restaurant where she lived. Despite a hot shower and a glass of wine, she couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones since they'd discovered the hidden room. The locket sat on her nightstand, its tarnished surface catching the lamplight. On impulse, she took a photo of it and the strange symbols etched into its surface, then sent the image to her friend Rachel, an art history professor at Northwestern. "Found this at the diner. Any idea what these symbols might be?" she texted. Rachel's response came quickly. Where did you get this? These look Sumerian, but there's something off about them. Can I see it in person? Megan promised to bring it by the university the next day, then tried to settle in for the night. Sleep proved elusive, however. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren on Milwaukee Avenue seemed magnified in the darkness. And beneath it all was another sound, a faint rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. At first, Megan told herself it was just the pipes. Old buildings made noises, especially ones with plumbing issues. But as the night wore on, the tapping became more insistent, more deliberate. Almost like Morse code, she thought, or someone trying to get her attention. Around 3 a.m., she finally gave up on sleep and went downstairs to the diner. The tapping was louder here, emanating clearly from the basement door. Megan stood at the top of the stairs, her hand on the light switch, gathering her courage. The basement lights flickered on, revealing the staircase leading down into the room that had become the center of her unease. The plywood Ed had placed over the hole was visible from where she stood, seemingly undisturbed. Yet the tapping continued, now accompanied by what sounded like whispers, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. Megan descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a decision she might regret. The air grew colder as she reached the basement floor, her breath visible in small clouds. The hole in the wall leading to the hidden room gaped open, looking somehow larger than it had earlier. The plywood covering the hole in the floor had been moved slightly, creating a dark gap at one edge, and the tapping was coming from beneath it. Against every instinct, Megan approached the plywood cover and knelt beside it. The whispers grew more distinct as she leaned closer, though still incomprehensible. Multiple voices speaking in overlapping patterns, creating a disorienting chorus. "Hello?" she called softly, immediately regretting it as the whispers abruptly ceased. For several heartbeats, there was absolute silence. Then a single voice spoke from beneath the floor, clear, male, and terrifyingly close. "We've been waiting for you, Megan." She scrambled backward, nearly falling in her haste to get away from the hole. How did it know her name? The plywood cover began to slide sideways, moved by some unseen force from below. Paralyzed with fear, Megan watched as a hand emerged from the darkness. A human hand, grimy with dirt and what looked like decades of filth, its fingernails long and yellowed. The hand was followed by an arm clad in what might once have been a work shirt, now reduced to tattered rags, and then a face began to appear. A man's face, gaunt and pale, with eyes that reflected the basement lights like a nocturnal animal's. Megan found her voice and screamed, the sound tearing from her throat and echoing off the basement walls. She turned and ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, not looking back even as she heard something heavy pull itself out of the hole onto the basement floor. She slammed the basement door behind her and dragged a heavy table in front of it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the wood. From beyond the door came the sound of slow, dragging footsteps ascending the stairs. Fumbling with her phone, Megan called Ed. It went to voicemail. She tried Jake next, praying he would answer. "Hello?" Jake's voice was groggy with sleep. "Someone's in the basement," Megan whispered urgently, backing away from the door where a shadow now darkened the gap beneath it. "Someone came out of that hole." "What?" "Megan, slow down. The tunnel, Jake." "There's a man. He came out of the tunnel. He knew my name." Her voice broke on the last word. There was a pause, then Jake said, "I'm calling the police. Get out of the diner now. I'll meet you outside in 10 minutes. Megan ended the call and moved toward the front door, never taking her eyes off the basement entrance. The shadow remained visible beneath the door, but the footsteps had stopped. Whoever or whatever was on the other side seemed to be waiting. As she reached for the door handle, the lights throughout the diner flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the space into darkness broken only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds. And in that moment of darkness, Megan heard the basement door begin to open, the table scraping across the floor as it was pushed aside by something impossibly strong. Megan ran, out the front door of the diner and into the cold Chicago night, not stopping until she reached the corner of Milwaukee and Fullerton, where a 24-hour convenience store cast fluorescent light onto the sidewalk. The clerk looked up in alarm as she burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed. "Call the police," she gasped. "Someone broke into my diner." 20 minutes later, she sat in a police cruiser, watching as officers searched Rosie's. Jake had arrived shortly after the police, looking rumpled and concerned in hastily donned clothes. "Did they find anything?" he asked, joining her in the back seat of the cruiser where an officer had told her to wait. Megan shook her head. "They're still looking." The locket was a heavy presence in her pocket. She hadn't realized she'd grabbed it before fleeing, but now she took it out, the metal still unnaturally cold against her palm. "That's it, isn't it?" Jake asked quietly. "The thing you found?" Megan nodded. "It was in the basement, half buried in the dirt. I found it the night before you and Ed started work." Jake studied it without touching it. "Those are the same symbols from the wall." Before Megan could respond, a police officer approached the car. "Ma'am, we've searched the entire building. There's no sign of an intruder." "Did you check the basement? The tunnel?" The officer looked confused. "We found the basement room you described, and yes, there's a hole in the floor, but it's barely big enough for a child to fit through, let alone a grown man, and it only goes down about 3 feet before hitting solid earth." Megan stared at him in disbelief. "That's not possible. We saw it yesterday. It was a tunnel, big enough for Jake to climb into." Jake nodded in confirmation. "It's true, officer. I was down there myself." The officer shrugged. "Well, it's not there now. Maybe it collapsed overnight." He handed Megan her keys. "The building's secure. You can go back in if you want, or find somewhere else to stay tonight." After the police left, Megan and Jake stood on the sidewalk in front of Rosie's. The diner looked normal from the outside, its neon sign casting a warm red glow. "I'm not imagining things," Megan said firmly. "Someone came out of that hole." Jake looked troubled. "I believe you. I was down in that tunnel. It was real." He hesitated. "Let me call Ed. He should know about this." Ed arrived 30 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept much either. The three of them entered the diner together, Ed carrying a heavy flashlight that looked more like a weapon. The basement was as the police had described. The hole in the floor now appeared shallow, filled with packed earth just a few feet down. No tunnel, no passage leading toward Milwaukee Avenue. "This doesn't make any sense," Jake muttered, kneeling to examine the hole. "I was down there. I found that wrench." Ed nodded grimly. "I saw it too. That was no 3-foot hole." Megan stood by the broken wall, looking into the hidden room with its wall of symbols. "He said they'd been waiting for me. How did he know my name?" "Who said that?" Ed asked. "The man who came out of the hole. He spoke to me." Ed and Jake exchanged a look that Megan couldn't interpret. Finally, Ed said, "I think we need some outside help with this. I've got a buddy who works for the city in the historical archives. Maybe he can tell us if there's anything in the records about this place." Megan nodded, then remembered. "I sent a photo of this to a friend at Northwestern." She held up the locket. "She said the symbols might be Sumerian, but there was something off about them. I'm supposed to meet her today." "Good," Ed said. "We need answers. Jake and I will secure this area properly, then see what we can find out about the building's history." As they worked out their plans, none of them noticed the fine black dust that had begun to seep from the edges of the shallow hole in the floor. Dust that moved against the air currents, forming faint patterns on the concrete that mimicked the symbols on the wall. Later that morning, Megan sat in Rachel's cluttered office at Northwestern, watching as her friend examined the locket under a magnifying glass. "This is fascinating," Rachel murmured. "The base language is definitely Sumerian, but it's been altered, combined with something else I don't recognize." She looked up at Megan. "Where did you say you found this?" "In the basement of my grandmother's diner," Megan replied, deciding to keep the full story to herself for now. It was buried in the dirt floor. Rachel turned the locket over in her hands. It's old, very old, but the craftsmanship is incredible. She pointed to the intricate patterns. These symbols form a phrase that repeats around the edge. It's a warning of some kind. What does it say? Megan asked, though part of her already knew the answer. My Sumerian is rusty, but it's something like, they dwell beneath, in darkness waiting. There's more, but I'd need time to translate it properly. Rachel attempted to open the locket again. It seems to be sealed shut. I could try to... No, Megan said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. I mean, not yet. Let's figure out what it says first. Rachel gave her a curious look, but nodded. I'll need to consult some references. Can you leave it with me for a day or two? Megan hesitated, her hand instinctively moving to take back the locket. The thought of being separated from it filled her with inexplicable dread. Yet at the same time, she wanted to be rid of it, to throw it into Lake Michigan and never think of it again. Yes, she said finally, forcing her hand back to her lap. Just be careful with it. As she left the university, Megan felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. The day was bright and clear, the October sun warming her face as she walked to her car. For the first time since finding the locket, her mind felt clear. That clarity lasted until she received a text from Jake. Found something in city records. You need to see this. Meeting Ed at the diner at 3. Megan arrived at Rosie's diner to find Jake already there, sitting at the counter with a folder full of photocopied documents spread before him. His expression was grim. Ed's on his way, he said as she hung up her coat. His friend at the city archives came through in a big way. What did you find? Megan asked, sliding onto a stool beside him. Jake pushed a brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping toward her. It was dated October 17th, 1943, with the headline, Local Plumber Missing, Foul Play Suspected. The article described how Harold Winters, a plumber working on repairs at Rosie's Luncheonette, the original name of what was now Rosie's Diner, had disappeared during a job, leaving behind his tools and truck. Police suspected robbery or kidnapping, as Winters had recently come into a substantial inheritance. He was never found. There's more, Jake said, his voice low. He laid out another clipping from 1967. Second disappearance at local diner remains unsolved. This article detailed the disappearance of another plumber, Michael Chen, who had been called to repair a persistent leak at the same location. Like Winters before him, Chen vanished without a trace, his tools left behind in the basement. This has happened before, Megan whispered, her fingers tracing the faded print. Twice before. Jake nodded. And that's not all. He produced a much older document, this one a property record from 1891. Before the diner, this land belonged to a doctor named Elias Warner. He built a house here, but it was demolished after he was committed to an asylum. Apparently, he'd become obsessed with digging in his basement, claiming he heard voices from below. The bell above the door jingled as Ed entered, carrying another stack of papers. His face was ashen. You showed her the articles? He asked Jake, who nodded. Well, there's more, a lot more. He set his papers on the counter. My buddy pulled everything he could find on this address. Turns out there have been problems here going back over a century. The documents Ed had brought detailed a pattern of strange occurrences at the property, unexplained noises, structural issues that defied explanation, and most disturbing of all, a total of 7 disappearances between 1891 and 1967, all of them workers who had been involved in digging, construction, or plumbing repairs. The building's been rebuilt 3 times, Ed explained, pointing to architectural drawings. The original house, then a market in the 1920s, and finally this diner in the early 60s. But the basement, or at least parts of it, has remained largely unchanged. Megan stared at the documents, a cold realization settling over her. So whatever's down there has been there the whole time. Ed nodded grimly. And it doesn't want to be disturbed. Jake, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. There's something else we found. Something about your family, Megan. She looked up sharply. What about my family? Ed and Jake exchanged an uncomfortable glance before Ed continued. Your grandmother, Rosie Turner, she bought this place in 1962, right? When Megan nodded, he went on. Well, according to these records, she got it for well below market value after it had sat empty for years. No one wanted it because of the rumors. What rumors? That it was cursed. That people who dug too deep disappeared. Ed hesitated. And there's a connection to your grandmother that's unusual. Her maiden name was Warner. Elias Warner, the doctor who originally built on this land, was her great-grandfather. The implications hit Megan like a physical blow. Are you saying my grandmother knew about this? That she knew what was down there? We don't know that, Jake said quickly. But it's a strange coincidence. Megan thought about her grandmother, practical no-nonsense Rosie, who had run the diner with an iron will for nearly 50 years. Had she known about the things beneath her restaurant? Had she been protecting something or containing it? The locket, she said suddenly. I need to get it back from Rachel. The locket, Ed asked. The one I found in the basement. It has the same symbols that are on that wall down there. Rachel said it's some kind of warning in Sumerian. Before either man could respond, Megan's phone rang. It was Rachel. Megan, where are you? Her friend's voice was tense, urgent. At the diner. What's wrong? I opened the locket. Rachel's words came in a rush. I know you said not to, but I found a way to do it without damaging it. Megan, there's something inside, a piece of paper with an address. Your address. Megan felt the blood drain from her face. Rachel, that's not all, Rachel continued. The paper looks new, but the ink is old, really old. And after I opened it, I started hearing things, whispers coming from my walls. A chill ran down Megan's spine. Rachel, listen to me. Put the locket back exactly as you found it and get out of your office. I'm coming to get you. I'm already home, Rachel replied, her voice shaking. I couldn't stay there. The whispers followed me, Megan. They're in my apartment now. They're saying your name. Ed and Jake were watching Megan with growing concern as her expression shifted from worry to horror. Stay where you are, Megan told Rachel. We're coming right now. As she ended the call, the lights in the diner flickered, then went out completely. A moment later, they came back on, but weaker, dimmer somehow. And with the lights came a sound from the basement, the unmistakable noise of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. We need to go. Now. Megan grabbed her keys, already moving toward the door. Jake and Ed followed close behind, but before they could reach the exit, the basement door swung open. The figure that emerged was barely recognizable as human, tall and gaunt, with skin that hung loosely on its frame like old paper. It wore the tattered remains of work clothes from another era. Its eyes reflected the dim light with an unnatural glow, and its mouth, stretched too wide in what might have been a smile, revealed teeth that had grown long and sharp. Megan Turner, it said in a voice like gravel sliding down a chute, granddaughter of Rosie, keeper of the gate. Ed pushed Megan behind him, facing the creature with remarkable composure for a man confronting the impossible. What the hell are you? The thing's head tilted at an unnatural angle, joints crackling. We have been called many names over the centuries. The Sumerians knew us as the Anunnaki, the Greeks as the chthonic ones. It took a step forward, movements jerky and wrong. Your kind has forgotten us, but we remember. We always remember. Jake had backed toward the door, pulling Megan with him. Ed, come on! But Ed stood his ground, placing himself between the creature and his companions. What do you want? The thing's grin widened impossibly further. What was promised to us? What has always been ours? Its gaze fixed on Megan. The locket, the key, the blood of the keeper. With a speed that defied its awkward movements, the creature lunged forward. Ed swung his heavy flashlight, connecting with the thing's head with a sound like a hammer hitting dry wood. It staggered back, black fluid oozing from the wound, but didn't fall. Run! Ed shouted, swinging again as the creature recovered. Jake yanked open the door, pulling Megan outside. They heard a crash from within, followed by Ed's shout of pain. Jake hesitated, clearly torn between helping his mentor and getting Megan to safety. "I'll be right behind you," Ed's voice called out, strained but determined. The decision was made for them as the front window of the diner exploded outward, showering the sidewalk with glass. Through the broken window, they saw Ed grappling with the creature, both of them crashing over tables in a desperate struggle. "The car!" Megan pulled Jake toward her Honda parked at the curb. They jumped in, Megan fumbling with the keys as adrenaline made her hands shake. As the engine roared to life, the diner's door burst open. But it wasn't Ed who emerged. It was the creature, now moving with a fluid grace that belied its decrepit appearance. In one hand, it held Ed's flashlight, now slick with something dark. Megan floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward as the thing leapt toward them. Its hand slapped against the rear window with a sound like cracking ice before sliding away as the Honda shot into traffic, narrowly avoiding a delivery truck. "Oh my God!" Jake gasped, twisted in his seat to look behind them. "What about Ed? We can't just leave him." "We're not," Megan said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated through traffic with reckless speed. "But we need help, and we need to get to Rachel." She fumbled for her phone, handing it to Jake. "Call 911. Tell them there's been an attack at the diner, that Ed is hurt." Jake made the call, his voice shaking as he reported an assault at Rosie's diner. He gave Ed's description and said he was injured, possibly seriously. When the dispatcher asked for details about the attacker, Jake hesitated before describing a tall man in ragged clothes. "They're sending officers and an ambulance," he said, after ending the call. "But Megan, what was that thing? What did it mean about your grandmother being keeper of the gate?" Megan shook her head, narrowly avoiding a cyclist as she turned onto Diversey Parkway. "I don't know. My grandmother never said anything about any of this." But even as she spoke, memories surfaced, little things she'd dismissed over the years. The way her grandmother would never allow renovations to the basement, insisting it was structurally necessary to leave it alone. The salt lines she'd sometimes find along the basement doorway. The strange charms hidden throughout the building that Megan had assumed were just old-world superstitions. "Rachel lives in Lakeview," she said, pushing the thoughts aside. "We'll be there in 10 minutes if traffic holds." Jake checked the rearview mirror compulsively, as if expecting to see the creature loping after them through traffic. "Do you think it will follow us?" "I don't know. But it wants the locket, and Rachel has it." They rode in tense silence for several minutes, both jumping at every horn blast and sudden movement in their peripheral vision. Finally, Jake spoke again. "You said your friend mentioned whispers in her walls." "That's what I heard in the tunnel before I found the wrench, whispers like multiple voices talking at once." Megan nodded grimly. "Whatever's happening started when I found that locket, or maybe when I took it from the basement. It's connected somehow." "The keeper of the gate," Jake murmured. "What gate? The wall we broke through?" "I don't think so. That thing said the Sumerians knew them. That's thousands of years older than the diner or anything built on that land." Megan took a sharp turn onto Rachel's street. "I think whatever's under Rosie's has been there a lot longer than any of the buildings." Rachel's apartment was in a converted brownstone, her unit on the second floor. Megan parked haphazardly, and they rushed to the entrance, buzzing Rachel's apartment repeatedly. There was no answer. "Try calling her," Jake suggested, glancing nervously up and down the quiet residential street. Megan did, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Something's wrong. She said she'd wait for us here." The building's security door was old, with a simple intercom system. Jake examined it briefly, then pulled a credit card from his wallet. "I can get this open. My first apartment had the same setup." Under normal circumstances, Megan might have objected to breaking in, but fear for her friend overrode such concerns. Jake manipulated the card in the door jamb for a few seconds before the lock clicked open. They took the stairs to the second floor, finding Rachel's apartment at the end of a carpeted hallway. Megan knocked loudly. "Rachel, it's Megan. Are you in there?" Silence answered her. She tried the doorknob and found it unlocked, unusual for Chicago, where most residents locked their doors habitually. The apartment beyond was dark, despite the afternoon sun outside. "Rachel!" Megan called again, pushing the door open wider. Jake stayed close behind her as they entered the unit. Rachel's apartment was normally immaculate, her academic precision extending to her living space. Now, it looked like a whirlwind had torn through it. Books lay scattered across the floor, furniture was overturned, and the walls— "Jesus," Jake whispered, staring at the walls where Rachel had scrawled the same symbols from the diner's hidden room, covering nearly every surface with frantic overlapping markings. "Rachel!" Megan called more urgently, moving deeper into the apartment. She found her friend in the bedroom, huddled in a corner, still writing on the wall with what looked like a fountain pen, the ink staining her fingers black. "Rachel, stop. It's me, Megan." Rachel turned slowly, her eyes unfocused and dilated. In her free hand, she clutched the locket, now open to reveal an interior that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "They're coming," Rachel said, her voice eerily calm. "They've been waiting so long, trapped below. The gate is weakening without a proper keeper." She held out the locket. "You need to take it. It's yours by blood." Megan approached cautiously, as if Rachel were a frightened animal that might bolt. "What happened, Rachel? What did you find out about the locket?" "It's not just a warning," Rachel said, her hand continuing to draw symbols even as she spoke. "It's a key, a binding. The Warner family has always known what lies beneath Chicago. They've kept it contained for generations, passing the responsibility from mother to daughter." Jake stood in the doorway, watching the exchange with growing unease. "Megan, I don't think we should be here." Rachel's gaze snapped to him, suddenly sharp. "You broke the wall. You made a hole. They've been trying to get out for centuries, and you gave them away." Her attention returned to Megan. "Your grandmother was the keeper before you. She should have told you, prepared you." "Prepared me for what?" Megan asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "To maintain the binding. To keep them below." Rachel pressed the locket into Megan's hand. "They feed on fear, on despair. The more people know about them, the stronger they become. That's why it has to be kept secret, passed only from keeper to keeper." As soon as the locket touched Megan's skin, a jolt of something, not quite pain, not quite pleasure, shot up her arm. The symbols Rachel had drawn seemed to writhe on the walls, forming patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. And with that sensation came knowledge, images and information flooding her mind like a dam breaking. She saw her grandmother performing rituals in the basement of Rosie's, strengthening ancient bindings. She saw Dr. Warner, driven mad by the whispers but determined to contain what he'd discovered beneath his home. And she saw older keepers stretching back through time, each bearing the burden of containment. "They got to Harold Winters in 1943, Rachel continued, her writing becoming more frantic. "And Michael Chen in 67. Both times the keepers managed to seal the breach, but at a cost. Blood must be paid when the bindings are renewed." Jake had moved to the window, looking out at the street below. "Megan," he said, his voice tight with fear. "There's someone outside, looking up at the building." Megan joined him at the window. On the sidewalk below stood the creature from the diner, its head tilted back to stare directly at their window. It no longer attempted to look human, its body elongated and wrong, joints bent at impossible angles. And it wasn't alone. 2 more figures had joined it, emerging from the shadows between buildings. All 3 looked up at the window, their eyes reflecting the afternoon sun like mirrors. "They've found us," Megan whispered. "We need to get out of here," Jake urged, already moving toward the door. Rachel hadn't moved from her corner, still writing symbols that now covered the walls, ceiling, and had begun to spill onto the floor. "Too late," she said softly. "They're already inside." As if summoned by her words, A sound came from the apartment's living room, the wet, sliding noise of something moving across the floor. Jake grabbed a heavy lamp from Rachel's nightstand, wielding it like a club as he positioned himself in the bedroom doorway. Megan clutched the locket, which now seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. "What do we do?" she asked Rachel, who had finally stopped writing and sat with her back against the wall, oddly calm amidst the chaos she'd created. "The binding ritual," Rachel replied. "Your grandmother should have taught you, but I've written it all around us now." She gestured to the symbols covering the walls. "You need to complete it with blood. The blood of the keeper. Your blood." The sounds from the living room grew louder, a dragging, slithering noise punctuated by the crack of breaking furniture. "Whatever you're going to do, do it fast," Jake said, his voice strained as he stared into the darkened hallway beyond the bedroom door. Megan looked down at the locket in her palm, then at the impossible symbols surrounding them. The knowledge that had flooded her mind when she touched the locket included fragments of a ritual, words in a language no human had spoken aloud for millennia. "I need something sharp," she said. Rachel pointed to a letter opener on her desk, its edge gleaming in the dim light. Megan grabbed it, then hesitated. "Jake, get Rachel out of here. Take the fire escape from the window." Jake shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving you. I'll be right behind you, but I need to do this, and I need to know Rachel is safe." Before Jake could argue further, a figure appeared in the hallway, not the creature from the diner, but something worse. It moved on all fours, its body twisted and elongated like a human form that had been stretched beyond recognition. Its skin was pallid and translucent, revealing shadowy movements beneath the surface that didn't correspond to any recognizable internal organs. Jake swung the lamp, connecting solidly with the thing's head. It made a sound like escaping steam and recoiled momentarily, giving him enough time to grab Rachel and pull her toward the window. "Megan, come on, go!" she shouted, already slicing the letter opener across her palm. Blood welled immediately bright red against her skin. "I'll be right behind you." As Jake wrestled with the window latch, Megan pressed her bleeding palm against the locket. The metal grew hot, nearly burning where it touched her skin. Words formed in her mind, ancient syllables that felt like stones in her mouth as she began to speak them aloud. The creature in the hallway shrieked, a sound no human throat could produce. It threw itself forward, only to hit what appeared to be an invisible barrier at the bedroom doorway. The symbols Rachel had drawn, forming a temporary protection. Megan continued the chant, her voice growing stronger as the words came more easily. Her blood spread across the locket, filling the intricate engravings, causing the metal to glow with an inner light. Jake had managed to open the window and was helping Rachel onto the fire escape. "Megan, we have to go now." The barrier at the doorway was weakening, the symbols seeming to fade as the creature pressed against it, its body distorting horribly as it sought a way through. Megan finished the chant with a final guttural phrase. The locket flared with blinding light, and the creature howled in what might have been pain or rage. The symbols on the walls pulsed once, twice, then began to fade like smoke, dissipating. "Now!" Jake yelled, reaching for Megan. She grabbed his hand and allowed herself to be pulled toward the window. Behind her, the barrier collapsed entirely, and the creature surged into the room, followed by two more of its kind, crawling along the ceiling and walls. Megan scrambled onto the fire escape, Jake slamming the window shut behind her. The glass wouldn't hold them for long, but it might buy precious seconds. Rachel was already descending the metal stairs, moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. They hurried down the fire escape, the metal clanging under their feet. Above them, the window exploded outward in a shower of glass, and one of the creatures began to slither down the side of the building, moving like some impossible spider. "My car!" Megan gasped as they reached the alley behind the building. "We need to get to my car." They ran toward the street, supporting Rachel between them. As they rounded the corner of the building, they saw Megan's Honda where they'd left it. But standing between them and the vehicle were the three creatures they'd seen from the window. "Back!" Jake hissed, pulling them into the shadow of the building. Is there another way around? Megan shook her head. We'd have to go all the way around the block. She looked down at the locket, still glowing faintly in her hand. I think I bought us some time with the ritual, but it's not complete. It needs to be finished at the source, at the diner. The police should be there by now, Jake said. They might have helped Ed. A sudden horrible thought struck Megan. Unless these things got to them first. The decision was made for them as one of the creatures on the street turned in their direction. Its head swiveling at an impossible angle, it made a chittering sound that alerted its companions. "Run!" Jake shouted, pulling Rachel with him as they sprinted back down the alley. They ran without direction, simply trying to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, scaling walls and leaping between buildings with inhuman agility. After several frantic minutes, they found themselves in a commercial area, surrounded by shops and restaurants, filled with afternoon customers, witnesses, potential help. "In here," Megan said, pulling them into a crowded coffee shop. The sudden transition from terror to mundane normalcy was jarring, people sipping lattes, working on laptops, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding outside. They found a table in the corner, all three breathing heavily. Rachel seemed to be coming out of her shock, blinking at her surroundings in confusion. What happened?" she asked, her voice small. "I remember opening the locket, and then—" She looked down at her ink-stained hands. "Did I write all those symbols?" "It's complicated," Megan said, unwilling to trigger another episode by explaining too much. "But we need to get back to the diner. There's something I have to finish there." Jake checked the street through the coffee shop window. "I don't see them. Maybe they can't follow us into crowded places. Or maybe they're waiting," Megan replied grimly. "We need a plan." As they sat there trying to gather their thoughts, Megan's phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. "Hello? Megan, it's Ed." His voice was weak, pained, but unmistakably alive. Relief flooded through her. "Ed, are you okay? Where are you?" "Hospital, Northwestern Memorial. Those things, they're not human, Megan." "I know. We're dealing with them now." "How badly are you hurt?" Ed coughed, a wet sound that worried her. "Couple broken ribs, concussion, nothing that won't heal. But listen, that's not why I called. The police found something at the diner after you left, in that hidden room. Something in the wall behind all those symbols." Megan tightened her grip on the phone. "What was it?" "A door, Megan. A sealed door with more of those symbols carved into it. And it's opening." Stealing a car had never been on Megan's list of life experiences. But desperate times called for desperate measures. After ending the call with Ed, they'd formulated a hasty plan. The creatures were somehow tied to the locket, following her, which meant they could use that to their advantage. They'd left the coffee shop separately, Rachel heading toward the nearest police station, while Megan and Jake set out to borrow transportation. Jake's experience with locks extended beyond apartment doors, and within 10 minutes they were driving a nondescript sedan toward Rosie's diner. "I still think we should have gone to the police with Rachel," Jake said, gripping the dashboard as Megan took a corner too fast. "And tell them what? That ancient Sumerian monsters are coming out of my basement." Megan shook her head. "They'd lock us up for psychiatric evaluation while those things spread throughout the city." The locket sat in her lap, still warm from the partial ritual she'd performed in Rachel's apartment. The bleeding from her palm had stopped, but the cut throbbed in time with the locket's pulsing energy. "Ed said there's a door," Jake mused. "A sealed door that's opening. That has to be the gate the creature mentioned." Megan nodded grimly. "My family has been keeping whatever's behind that door contained for generations, and we broke the seal when we knocked through that wall." Traffic thinned as they approached Logan Square, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the streets. The diner came into view, surrounded by police cars with lights flashing. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the entrance. "How do we get past them?" Jake wondered aloud. Megan parked a block away, considering their options. "The back alley. There's a delivery entrance that leads to the kitchen. If we're lucky, they haven't secured it yet." They approached cautiously, staying out of sight of the offices at the front of the building. The alley behind Rosie's was empty, save for dumpsters and delivery crates. The back door, as Megan had hoped, was unguarded. "It's locked," Jake said after trying the handle. Megan reached into her pocket and produced a key. "Grandmother always said to be prepared." They slipped inside, finding the kitchen eerily quiet. The usual sounds of sizzling grills and clattering dishes were replaced by an oppressive silence. Through the service window, they could see officers moving around the dining area, taking photographs and collecting evidence. "The basement access," Megan whispered, pointing to a door near the walk-in refrigerator. "It connects to the main basement. We can get to the hidden room that way." They moved silently across the kitchen, freezing when an officer's voice came from the dining area. "Anybody check the back yet?" "On it," another voice replied. Jake and Megan ducked behind a counter as footsteps approached the kitchen. The officer appeared in the doorway, glancing around perfunctorily before speaking into his radio. "Kitchen's clear, heading back." As soon as he returned to the dining area, they made for the basement door. It opened with a creak that seemed deafening in the quiet kitchen, but the noise of the investigation out front covered the sound. The narrow service stairs led down to a different part of the basement than the main access, a storage area filled with dry goods and restaurant supplies. Megan led the way through the maze of shelves to a connecting door that opened onto the main basement. They paused at the threshold, listening. Voices echoed from the hidden room, officers documenting the scene. One voice rose above the others. "I want structural engineers down here ASAP. This whole area is unstable." Megan and Jake exchanged a look. They would have to wait for the police to leave before they could access the hidden room. "There's another way," Megan whispered, a memory surfacing from the knowledge that had flooded her mind when she first held the locket. "A passage my grandmother used. This way." She led Jake to what appeared to be a solid wall behind some shelving units. After moving several boxes, she pressed against a specific brick. With a scraping sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel. "How did you know about this?" Jake asked, amazed. Megan stared at the opening. "I didn't. Not until I touched the locket. It's like I'm remembering things I never knew." The tunnel was barely wide enough for them to move in single file, the ceiling so low they had to crouch. The air was stale and thick, with the same metallic scent they'd encountered in the hidden room. After what felt like an eternity of claustrophobic crawling, the passage widened into a small chamber. Ancient support beams, far older than the diner above, held up a ceiling of packed earth. The walls were covered in the now familiar symbols, but these were carved directly into the stone rather than painted. "What is this place?" Jake whispered, his voice echoing slightly despite his low volume. "A sanctuary," Megan replied, the knowledge coming to her as she spoke, "where the keepers performed the binding ritual when needed." At the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands. Grooves carved into the stone formed a pattern that matched the symbols on the locket. "This is it," Megan said, approaching the pedestal. "This is where I need to complete the ritual." Jake hung back, watching nervously as Megan placed the locket in the center of the pedestal. It fit perfectly into a depression in the stone, as if made for it. "What happens now?" he asked. Before Megan could answer, a tremor ran through the chamber, dislodging dust from the ceiling. From somewhere nearby came the sound of breaking masonry and alarmed shouts. "The police!" Jake said. "Something's happening in the hidden room." Megan knew they had little time. She reopened the cut on her palm with her fingernail, wincing at the pain. Blood welled up once more, and she placed her bleeding hand on the locket. The words came more easily this time, the ancient language flowing from her lips as if she'd spoken it all her life. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a faint blue light, responding to the ritual. Another stronger tremor shook the chamber. Jake steadied himself against the wall. "Megan, whatever you're doing, do it faster." The locket grew hot beneath her hand, the metal seeming to melt and reform under her blood. The final words of the ritual built to a crescendo, Megan's voice growing stronger as the chamber shook around them. With the final syllable, a pulse of energy radiated outward from the pedestal, making the air ripple visibly. The symbols on the walls flared blindingly bright, then faded to a steady, soft glow. Silence fell. "Did it work?" Jake asked after a moment. Megan lifted her hand from the locket, which had transformed into something new. The metal now formed an intricate key, the symbols rearranged into a pattern she somehow recognized as a locking mechanism. "Not yet," she said, taking the key. "We need to find the door." They returned to the tunnel, moving more quickly now despite their exhaustion. The passage curved, bringing them to another opening, this one leading directly into the hidden room where they'd first discovered the symbols on the wall. The room was in chaos. The police had evacuated, leaving equipment scattered behind. The wall of symbols had cracked down the middle, revealing what Ed had described on the phone. A door, ancient beyond reckoning, covered in carvings that matched those on the key in Megan's hand. Most terrifying of all, the door stood ajar, darkness seeping through the gap like living smoke. "We're too late," Jake whispered. "It's already opening." "No," Megan said with determination. "Not yet. Not completely." She approached the door, the key clutched tightly in her bleeding hand. As she drew near, whispers filled the air. Countless voices speaking in languages long dead, some pleading, others threatening. Jake remained at the tunnel entrance, unwilling to approach the door. "Megan, be careful." The darkness leaking through the gap in the door seemed to reach for her, tendrils of shadow curling toward her feet. Megan raised the key, and the whispers grew more frantic, more desperate. "By blood and binding," she said, repeating words she somehow knew. "I seal this gate." She thrust the key into a lock that had been invisible until that moment. It turned with surprising ease, and the door began to close, pushing back against the darkness that fought to escape. The whispers became screams, the shadows coalescing into half-formed shapes that clawed at the narrowing gap. Megan held firm, continuing to turn the key as the door inched closed. With a final, definitive click, the lock engaged. The screams cut off abruptly, and the shadows dissipated like mist in sunlight. Megan stepped back, exhausted but triumphant. The wall reformed before their eyes, the symbols rearranging themselves into a new pattern, a stronger binding. "It's done," she said softly, "for now." 1 month later, Megan stood in the newly renovated basement of Rosie's Diner, watching as contractors installed improved drainage and sealed the foundation walls with waterproof coating. The leak that had started it all had been fixed, along with numerous other issues that had plagued the building for decades. The hidden room remained sealed, the wall rebuilt with modern materials but inscribed with the ancient symbols, hidden beneath a layer of ordinary plaster. Only Megan knew they were there, maintaining their protective function while keeping their secret. Jake entered, carrying coffee for both of them. In the weeks since their ordeal, he'd become more than just an ally in the supernatural. He'd become a friend, perhaps something more. "Looks good," he said, nodding toward the work being done. "No one would ever know what happened here." "That's the idea," Megan replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Ed had recovered from his injuries and retired from plumbing, deciding that 30 years in the trade was enough. He'd stop by the diner occasionally, never mentioning what had happened, but exchanging knowing looks with Megan and Jake. Rachel had no memory of her experience with the locket or the creatures, a blessing that Megan didn't question. Whatever influence had temporarily possessed her friend had faded when the gate was sealed. The locket-turned key now hung around Megan's neck, hidden beneath her clothes, where it maintained a comforting warmth against her skin. She had researched her family history extensively in the past month, discovering generations of keepers stretching back centuries. The responsibility had always passed from mother to daughter, or grandmother to granddaughter when necessary. Do you ever wonder what they were? Jake asked quietly, watching the contractors work. What was behind that door? Megan shook her head. Some questions are better left unanswered. My grandmother knew that. That's why she never told me about any of this. She was protecting me. Until you needed to know, Jake pointed out. The locket found you when it was needed. That was true. Somehow, the locket had emerged from where it had been hidden, making itself known to Megan just when the binding was weakening. Perhaps her grandmother had arranged it somehow, a final safeguard from beyond the grave. The city's built on secrets, Megan said, gazing at the newly reinforced walls. Not just Chicago, every city, every town. Places where things were buried and forgotten, doors that were sealed for good reason. And people like you to keep those doors closed, Jake added. Megan nodded, touching the key beneath her shirt. For now, at least, until the next keeper comes along. The renovation would be complete within days, and Rosie's Diner would reopen to the public, serving comfort food just as it had for over 60 years. Customers would never know about the things that dwelled beneath the checkered floor or the ancient binding that kept them contained. And on quiet nights, when the last customer had left and the kitchen had gone dark, Megan would sometimes descend to the basement alone. She would place her hand against the wall that wasn't just a wall, feeling the faint vibration of what lay beyond. A reminder of her responsibility, her legacy, for some doors were never meant to be opened, and some secrets were meant to stay buried. And sometimes, when plumbers dig too deep and leave their tools behind, it's not because they ran away, it's because something else decided they should stay.